From the North African meetings came the Allied decision to bomb Germany around the clock. American B-17s helped carry the war to the German backyard. The decision to invade Sicily also was reached, and in July of 1943, Americans and British jumped off from Africa on the preliminary leg to the first assault on Fortress Europe, the Italian mainland. A strong partisan for the Women's Army Corps, as important to our mobilization, the Chief of Staff made it a point to be in Washington the day Colonel Ovita Cope-Hobby was sworn in as its new commander. By the time the Allied leaders convened at Cairo in December 1943, the Italian campaign was well underway, and the war against the Japanese demanded stepped-up operations. The future of the China-Burma-India theater and the problem of harnessing China's manpower had to be resolved. At Tehran, Marshall took part in planning joint strategy with the Russians. Soviet demands for an expanded second front were addressed to the United States. It was George Marshall who answered them. When the Chief of Staff visited the Pacific Theater on his return from Tehran, our offensive was gaining speed. Island by island, we were moving in on Japan. At Goodenough Island in 1944, Marshall listened to a first-hand report on the successful operations in the Gilbert Islands and the planned invasion of the Marshalls. Marshall conferred with General Douglas MacArthur, theater commander, as the Allies were gearing for the big Pacific push which would carry them to the very doorstep of Japan. Italy had become a slow and painful struggle. The road to Rome was a long one, and for Marshall and his wife, one of extreme personal anxiety. As a tank commander under Patton, Marshall's stepson had been engaged in the heaviest fighting for weeks. When the Americans finally broke through the lines of a stubborn enemy, the young officer fought his last fight. For General Marshall, the war had turned into a personal tragedy. When the spring of 1944 brought the long-planned invasion of France, Marshall accompanied General Eisenhower and other high-ranking officers ashore for an inspection of the American positions on the Normandy beachhead. "15 stars fill this corporal's jeep as Admiral King and Generals Marshall, Bradley, and Eisenhower ride out to survey the battle damage. On this trip, Marshall takes a few moments to visit an old friend, the colorful ex-cavalryman Patton, whose fast-moving armored columns had many times torn great holes in the German defenses. Marshall considered Patton one of the ablest field commanders in the Army, and the Chief of Staff had personally ordered the Mercurial General to his original combat assignment in North Africa. The subsequent performance of the troops under Patton's command confirmed General Marshall's wise choice. Allied planners met again in 1944, this time at Quebec. A decision was reached to move the invasion of the Philippines 3 months ahead of schedule. Marshall returned from Quebec to fly immediately to Paris with Secretary of State James Burns for another meeting with General Eisenhower. The Chief of Staff was involved with the vast and complicated problem of our global supply lines, and he chose to inspect the divisions poised for the final thrust into Germany. A minor slack in the line of supply at this moment could cause a major military disaster, and Marshall knew all these facts at both ends of the line. The price of victory was far too high to risk delay. The trip to Europe provided Marshall with another opportunity, a chance to talk with the troops. He spoke informally to American soldiers who had faced the toughest test in history and triumphed. Marshall inspected their positions within range of the enemy, his last close look before the Axis collapsed, and World War II ended with the final capitulation of Japan. When President Truman presented Marshall with the Distinguished Service Medal in 1945, he said that although millions gave America extraordinary service, Marshall gave it victory. 1945 also saw Marshall dispatched to China as the president's special representative to negotiate a truce between Chiang Kai-shek and the communists. General Eisenhower, then Chief of Staff, visited his former boss during the negotiations. This was the first time Marshall officially functioned as a diplomat, but the role was not unfamiliar. Although the Army had been his profession, his country's interest had always been his career. Marshall received the oath of office as Secretary of State from Chief Justice Vinson early in 1947. The President enthusiastically endorsed the former Chief of Staff at a critical time in history. It was fairly said that Mr. Truman selected him not because of his experience, but because he was Marshall.
There's nothing that I can say at this time regarding matters that pertain to my position in the State Department. But I assume the duties with a feeling of great responsibility and a very earnest desire to carry out the foreign policy of this government in the manner that has been so splendidly exemplified by my predecessor, Mr. Burns, my old friend.
The new secretary brought imagination and a dignified intensity to his job, which was equal to the world challenge. In March 1947, Marshall headed a delegation to Moscow, whose mission was the peace agreement on Germany and Austria. The opportunity to observe the Russian bear in his native environment was valuable in view of increasing Soviet hostility. Russia already loomed as the largest question mark in America's future. The desperate economic plight of Europe drew Marshall's whole attention upon his return, and his recommendations were presented to the Congress.
Europe is still emerging from the devastation and dislocation of the most destructive war in history. Within its own resources, Europe cannot achieve, within a reasonable time, economic stability. The solution would be much easier, of course, if all the nations of Europe were cooperating, but they are not. Far from cooperating, the Soviet Union and the Communist parties have proclaimed their determined opposition to a plan for European economic recovery. Economic distress is to be employed to further political ends. There are many who accept the picture that I have just drawn, but who raise a further question. Why must the United States carry so great a load in helping Europe? The answer is simple. The United States is the only country in the world today which has the economic power and productivity to furnish the needed assistance. The 6 1/8 billion proposed for the first 15 months is less than a single month's charge of the war. To be quite clear, this unprecedented endeavor of the new world to help the old is neither sure nor easy. It is a calculated risk. It is a difficult program, and you know far better than I do the political difficulties involved in this program. But there's no doubt whatever in my mind that if we decide to do this thing, we can do it successfully.
The great rubble heaps left by the war were soon diminished by an American investment in international friendship and goodwill, which also proved to be an effective economic weapon against spreading communism, the Marshall Plan. Offered on a self-help basis, Marshall Plan aid enabled many war-ravaged countries to regain their first foothold on a stable peacetime economy. Trade and production were stimulated, and communist plans which were dependent upon poverty and despair for their success were thwarted in many parts of the world. George Marshall resigned as Secretary of State in January 1949, intending to relax for the first time in almost 50 years. But the National Red Cross called upon him for one further task in the public interest when it asked him to serve as its head. Meeting with Polio Foundation Chief Basil O'Connor at the White House, Marshall outlined his plans for this vast mercy organization. Less than 1 year later, the president persuaded him to return to the government as Secretary of Defense. He flew to Korea, where he met with General Ridgway and other UN leaders. The man with the passion for facts was gathering them firsthand. This was a different American army than Marshall had known, and a different kind of war. The citizen soldier did the fighting in Korea, but this time under a UN banner and for a limited objective. In Washington, Marshall assumed the critical responsibility for all of the men and material necessary for victory in Korea. The peculiar circumstances of the conflict called for the existence of large American forces without total mobilization in the United States. Once more, George Marshall, the statesman, distinguished himself. Relaxation was rare for the busy cabinet member, but to the delight of a pretty queen, he did manage to officiate at the Shenandoah Apple Blossom Festival in 1951. On the 50th anniversary of his graduation, VMI paid tribute to General Marshall with a day named in his honor. Many of his old classmates came to Lexington to applaud the school's most distinguished graduate and to recall their years as members of the Cadet Corps. After a howitzer salute to this soldier statesman, the entire body of cadets stood at attention while Marshall was awarded Virginia's Distinguished Service Medal by Governor John Battle. Then, the man whose life represents the highest ideals of the Cadet Corps inspected the ranks of men who may be tomorrow's leaders. George Catlett Marshall resigned from the Defense Department and settled in Leesburg, Virginia in 1951. His public service spanned a critical half-century for our country, placing him in the ranks of great American patriots.
Free at last to pursue a private life at Dodana Manor, the man with a passion for facts will long be an example to those who follow in the Army, in the government of his country, and in a peaceful world he works so hard to make. Now this is Sergeant Stuart Queen, inviting you to be with us again for another look at the big picture.
The Big Picture is an official report for the armed forces and the American people. Produced by the Army Pictorial Center. Presented by the Department of the Army in cooperation with this station.